All right. Hi, everyone. This is our Advocacy Acronym broadcast. We are the word syndrome, so we chose the tagline, "We're in this together." I'm Maddie.
I'm Jacqueline.
I'm Nicole.
I'm Forrester.
I'm Hannah.
And we hope our discussion sparks a lot of interest and maybe educates some of you.
Okay, so let's just first give a brief overview and context of syndrome. So syndrome is a group of signs and symptoms that occur together and characterize a particular abnormality or condition. And it stems from the Greek syn, which means together, and run. So with syndrome, it's important to recognize that it's multiple things together, not just one specific thing when we're talking about disability. And then our tagline kind of fits in with that. So it is, "We are in this together." It's multiple things, like we are all together. And then also we played off the "we are" from "We Are Penn State." So society as a whole really needs to address accessibility.
All right, so we wanted to talk about the history of the word for a little, just to give some context. So as we just talked about, a syndrome means that it's various symptoms, but this doesn't necessarily mean that it's a disease, which a lot of people associate with the word syndrome. It's different in everyone. It's very diverse, and it doesn't really have a direct cause in a lot of scenarios. But because the word syndrome is such a medical word, it has a very negative connotation. It would imply that just because you're diagnosed with a syndrome, you should have a treatment or a cure. It implies the idea that curing is a necessary step in overcoming a syndrome. However, as we're going to talk about more, a lot of people with disabilities in a lot of communities don't want to change, and they're just diverse than other people. That doesn't mean that they need to be fixed. So that is one of the issues with the word syndrome. There's a lot of commonly known syndromes that I didn't even realize until I started looking at it. But there's been sort of a shift in the way we talk about syndromes. So for example, Down's syndrome is now called Down syndrome, to take away the possessiveness of who founded it and put more emphasis on the community and their diversity. And then things like Munchausen syndrome show us that it can be used in psychological disorders too, like genetic, psychological, and medical. So it's a very broad term. But that was changed to fictitious disorder to take away the negative connotations of the word syndrome. And these examples also show how prevalent the term is in our society today.
So one of the biggest things that comes into disability culture is the idea of stereotyping, which most people have probably heard of because it's overly used on a day-to-day basis. But stereotyping is basically the idea of overgeneralizing a population or a group of people. Some examples in your day-to-day life that you might have heard is "dumb blonde," "all Muslims are terrorists," or "men cannot be nurses." But there is also a lot of examples in disability culture, which we've been learning about this semester. A person with disability is brave or courageous. A person with a disability is helpless. A person with a disability are always wheelchair bound, which they all could be true. But at the same time, there is no thing pointing out that they are. Because not everyone that has a disability is helpless. Not all of them are wheelchair bound. There's so many disabilities. It's such a broad spectrum of disabilities, even looking at autism spectrum disorder. There's so many different places you could be on that spectrum, and it's crazy. So
yeah, people might not even see that their perceived disability as a disability. They might not even look at it like that. So I think it's really negative to just stereotype and automatically assume a negative perspective on it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and jumping in with the word syndrome, a lot of people have a very specific image of, they hear a certain term of, "Oh, that's this, that looks like this," when it can be completely different in every person.
The example that sticks out in my mind, especially this is so personal, because I have family members with OCD, and whenever you hear the word OCD, so many people always think, "Oh, neat freak." They just
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, I'm so OCD, I have OCD." And that is just such a big example of stereotyping, and how for many people with obsessive compulsive disorder,
so much more
freaks. It's so much more than that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's something
I feel
always
like invisible disabilities are like the biggest ones to get stereotyped.
I was just gonna say that.
yeah.
Like mental health is so like just not seen. Like I feel like everybody who says like, oh, you have depression, oh, you just cry all the time and you just lay in bed all day. Like, no, I'm still a functioning human being. Like I get up and I go to class, but like doesn't mean I'm not struggling.
And
But like people do, it's like that facade, like you have that like wall. The people are like, oh, I'm just gonna look at this like what's on the front wall, but I'm not gonna look at what's behind it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense to anyone, my brain is
No,
like
it did.
there. Yeah.
And going along with that, you have a lot of people who will say, "Oh, you're depressed. You don't look depressed. Or you don't look
I
like."
hate that phrase. That is the worst thing ever. You don't, or how we talked about in class, you don't look disabled.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about disability, I think it's always really important to mention person first language. So person first language is the idea of putting the person before the disability at hand. So an example is instead of saying an autistic person, saying a person diagnosed with ASD or autism spectrum disorder, or instead of wheelchair bound, a person who utilizes a wheelchair. And also the deaf person example, person who is part of the deaf community. So I think it's really important to use person first language because like you don't want to characterize someone by their disability. And also I feel like it imposes a negative perspective on people with disabilities when you put the disability first, like saying wheelchair bound, like people who utilize wheelchairs may not see it as wheelchair bound. They see it as their life. That is everywhere they go. It is their greatest tool. Like it doesn't have to be seen negatively.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I feel like people even do the not using person first language and they don't even realize that they're like, oh, I use this where I'm like, but wait, that's not the right word. Like now that we've like been in this class, I start like hearing it.
I'm just so
like,
much more aware.
Yeah, I'm like subconsciously like, wait a minute. That was not person first language.
Well,
because if you want to be an advocate and like advocate for people, you need to make sure that you're ensuring that like you automatically do person first language unless otherwise specified to be, you know, respectful that these are just diverse human beings and they're not categorized just by a disability.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to talk about a couple of the models of disability that you can view it from. And there's a lot more than what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the social model and the medical model, but there's also like the moral model and others that we're not going to cover right now because it doesn't really go with our word syndrome that we're really focusing on. So the social model is when you think of a person who has a disability stemming from the person themselves or stemming from society instead of the person themselves. And these barriers that a person with a disability has is coming from society, and those include attitudinal barriers and physical barriers. And physical or attitudinal barriers include things such as ableism, like if you think, like going back to stereotyping, if you're going to stereotype somebody, you're going to be ableist in that way because you're going to put somebody almost in like a box that you shouldn't be stereotyping somebody with. And so ableism, the definition of it is discrimination or prejudice against individuals with disabilities. So, for example, if you're believing that a person with a disability is incapable of doing something on their own and you're stereotyping them, that's being ableist. And a physical barrier is something in society that is preventing a person with a disability from doing something that somebody without a disability could be doing. So, for example, a building that doesn't have a ramp or an elevator, a person who utilizes a wheelchair would not be able to get into that building because of the physical barrier that society has imposed.
Yeah.
And we have a couple of discussion questions. So how have you guys seen attitudinal and physical barriers in either your hometown or even here at Penn State?
I think it's more common at Penn State than a lot of people think, especially because our saying is "we are," which is supposed to be based on inclusivity. It's really common, as we've talked about in our RHS class and just in with this group, how like things like Beaver Stadium and apartment buildings and everything, like they don't necessarily have accessible entrances for people who do use wheelchairs or other adaptations. So it's really difficult to like pride ourselves on accessibility and then recognize that here we have so many places that aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're going off of saying that Penn State isn't as accessible as it should be. Yeah. The fact that the whole entire like College Avenue is barely accessible to people with wheelchairs or who utilize something else that makes it harder to get around and harder to travel.
Right, like we were talking about that one pizza place downtown. I can't remember which one.
College Pizza.
College.
Yeah, that you can only get to by using stairs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even more than just like physical barriers, there's so many attitudinal barriers here because like you hear it when you pass by houses that are, you know, drinking or big groups of people, you always hear something that you just kind of turn your head and you're like, what? Like just terms that aren't person first language or are really outdated and harmful. Yeah, derogatory terms. And it's like, that could be very hard because if you are someone with a disability and you hear that, you're going to feel like isolated and bad about yourself, and it makes it harder for like society to be accessible to everyone.
And there's just attitudinal barriers because a lot of people are just not educated and aware of like what they're saying or physical barriers. So a lot of them don't know to advocate or to push for accessibility because they're just simply not educated enough or aware enough of what's going on. So that's our job to like continue to advocate and be aware.
Right. And going along with that, like this conversation, have you guys ever witnessed someone being ableist, like, I mean, like in your classes or like your peers or anything, you know what I mean? And then if like now that we're taking this class and we have more knowledge on things like this, what would you do if a situation like that happens now?
I actually just thought of something that I hear all the time now during COVID, since we're in a pandemic. I've seen people like post this on their social medias and say it to their friends. They're like, if you're just healthy, just be healthy and you'll be fine. Like if you're healthy, it doesn't matter. And then they think they can act reckless and party without like thinking about who else that might affect.
Crazy.
I think that's extremely ableist because it's not someone's fault. If they have a pre-existing condition or they went through something in their life and they're someone with a disability, like how does that make them like
they don't have a choice to be immunocompromised?
Exactly.
And like you'll hear people say, oh, well, it only affects somebody that has a condition or it only affects somebody who's older. And you just kind of think, well, like, what do you mean only? Like it affecting people, anybody is important to consider. You know what I mean? Like it's almost saying like that's not a priority because those people aren't with me.
Yeah, we have
like they're lesser in society.
We have so many Penn State peers like that had to stay home this semester, and I feel so bad that they can't go home.
My roommate had to go home because of it. And she's a healthy 18-year-old girl, and she had to go home. Like it's just people are being so reckless.
Everyone's just not like selfish about it. Actually, I'm not going to go into a COVID tangent now, but like I think, but it does kind of tie in where like people kind of think of themselves like with the not being safe with COVID while not thinking about everyone in the community, and I think that also kind of
it so applies to disabilities because I mean now we're kind of more like it's more mainstream with that, but like if you stop and think about it, it's the same way with people with disabilities. Like people don't think about everybody as a whole, the whole community. They kind of only think of people like them, people that are
people think of themselves, not about everyone else.
And I think it's also very hard when we grow up in a culture that is very like centered on yourself and what is best for like you know what I mean? Like I think a lot of people are very selfish and aren't very empathetic now, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What do you guys think the Penn State community can do to like make things better for everyone else and on this campus specifically?
I feel like one of the things we all like talked about is like increasing like advocacy like about disabilities and about like what's going on and about like, hey, you're saying like you can even just slightly say something like, hey, you just kind of hurt my feelings a little bit with saying that, or you shouldn't have said that about that person. I think we should talk about why you feel that, or just like talk through it.
Like talk to your friends about personal. Oh, sorry, you can go.
I think it's really important to hold people accountable when you hear something like that. Just because if you hear it and you're like, oh, they said this, like just thinking that isn't going to really change anything. You kind of have to be a person who is also educating others, because that's the only way you're going to spread knowledge.
Educate and advocate.
Right, like it starts here.
Like simply, if you hear your friends not using person first language, like kind of just being like, oh, hey, like you should say this or use this, like if they're like talking about somebody in a way that's not person first language, like just like that.
A lot of people,
like how you just said it, that was great. Like, you don't have to be like belligerent about it. You just gotta like kind of like, hey, like, you probably should just do this for the future. And if they like ask why, just explain to them, educate them on, and then just move on.
And I also think it would be a really good idea to, this is probably not going to happen, but if colleges and even high schools started having like required classes on inclusivity, like
I agree with that.
Disability and other things like race, gender, like, you know what I mean? I think that's
absolutely,
even incorporating, like making things inclusive. I know at my high school, people like students with disabilities were so isolated from the rest of the school. We had a wing in our school called D wing, and it wasn't disability wing, it was just D wing. Like that's not what it meant, but the students with disabilities, all of their classrooms were in that wing, and it was very far back in the back of the school, and people went their entire high school career never going past that wing, even knowing it was a thing. I know I have friends who didn't even know that those classes, that wing of the school was there, because
that's sad.
They're not inclusive at all and don't make the school inclusive, which I mean, Penn State luckily has made like great strides with trying to be inclusive, but I
still have a lot to do though.
There's always room for improvement.
Because that kind of, I feel like just from an education standpoint, that kind of fuels societal issues, because it begins in schools where like they're all like alter, or just people might not be educated on disability culture and everything like that.
Agreed.
So moving on to the medical model, this is a very common belief, especially in Western societies, that somebody with a disability needs to be fixed to live a good life. And this is really focused on the person with the disability being or having the problem rather than society, like the social model. And this also emphasizes that only others can, quote unquote, fix them. So like doctors and therapists, like these are the people that are going to help this person like be cured, essentially. And this is obviously very problematic. And we can go on to the discussion questions. So how do you think that people with disabilities feel about the medical model? And we can also talk about like using the term syndrome to describe certain disabilities.
I think that a lot of people dislike the term, and in my research, I actually found that even a lot of medical professionals don't like it because it's so misused to represent disease or something that can be fixed. And like we've heard with the deaf community, they don't want certain things. Like they don't want cochlear implants because a lot of them just feel that they are diverse, which they are. So why should they need like the quote unquote cure? So I think there is more of a trend nowadays to address that. Like, hey, maybe this isn't the best way to look at disabilities, and maybe we shouldn't frame them in this medical way.
I think there's some benefits to the medical model if people with disabilities want them, but I don't think it should be forced or be expected, because obviously, like, if we're just going like purely the medical approach, it's very detrimental. And also just like the concept of like, oh, you need to be fixed because you're different. Like if disabilities want like this or that, like, that's awesome. Like, that's great that resource is available. But like, I think that it's definitely been kind of negative.
I think it's very like interesting. Like when we watched the movie in class, Emmanuel's Gift, about Emmanuel in Ghana and how he was invited to the US to receive a prosthetic for his leg. We like saw he was able to live a normal life without his one leg, and he was fine. He actually he didn't mind it. Like, he still accomplished so many things without it and was fine with it. And he was invited to the US to receive a prosthetic, and it's just interesting to see how it didn't really change his life, and he wasn't like, oh my gosh, like, I need this. I mean, he was happy to get one. He was like, okay, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like needed, so that's why it shouldn't be forced to fix these things. Like,
Right.
he
Yeah.
lived a happy life before he received his prosthetic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like some people put the medical model, especially to pregnant women, that have to get that decide to get testing before they have the baby to see if there's any genetic factors that are going to implement any struggle or a different life. And it just, you can see that the doctors or somebody in their life is pushing that you should end this pregnancy because this baby has Down syndrome, or because this baby has whatever disease that they're born with.
Yeah, like, there can be benefits to addressing medical things, but going off of the medical model and like relying on it is really harmful to like how diverse we are as
like
human
ending
beings.
a human's life is not going to cure their disorder. Like, it's not
and
gonna,
like,
It also invalidates everyone, every person with that disability living. 'Cause yeah.
Right, which is why like we need to rely on the social model and be like, how about instead of putting it on the person to be cured, we put it on society to be accessible and to adapt to meet the needs of everyone.
And going along with this, what kind of training should medical professionals receive in order to avoid these kinds of stereotyping?
I feel like they should get some kind of like advocacy training just to continuously keep them up to date on things that are happening, or have them talk to people with these different disabilities so they can find out how these people feel about what these doctors and therapists are saying.
Yeah, or make them take like an RHS class like we're taking right now, like just something like that.
I feel like they would learn a lot.
And just
I've
like
never taken
seminars
one of
or
them.
education.
I kind of think that it's different if you're looking at like the mental health field versus physical health field. I think a lot of people, when you're talking about having like an anxiety disorder, for example, a lot of therapists are very like strongly encourage like using your anxiety in a good way and like doing something like in a good way, like incorporating it into your life because it's something that you have, like it's a part of you, and that's very important. And I think when you kind of look at mental health versus physical health, a lot of physical like health doctors are going to say like, oh, we can cure this. Like, you don't have to, you know what I mean? You don't have to live with this.
Mental health teaches you to live with it. Not try.
And lastly, why do you think that this model is so much more prevalent in Western societies than in others?
I know earlier that Nicole was talking about the movie we watched in class, or out of class, but in class, that was about the boy in Ghana, which like Ghana has such a different idea of what like the medical model is and what the United States and like Europe and stuff believes it is. Because they're thinking, they're shunning them for having a disability or being different.
I feel like they follow, I mean, like in some countries, they follow the moral model more. So, such as like an example in Ghana, like in their culture, they usually follow the moral model when looking at people with disabilities. So if they have a baby that was born with a disability, they view it as something coming from the gods or karma, that they did something wrong, that they have a baby with a disability because they're being punished. And in some cases, they even kill those babies, or they just leave them. They just leave them out alone, and they just view people as disabilities as inferior, which is not how we view them in the medical model usually.
And I think in Western societies, like we have since like the creation of more Western medications and how they found like vaccines and medications that can help a lot of things, which is very important. Like because of Western medicine, we've gone so far into Western medicine where that's like the only answer here. Even in like, we see in therapies and some things where, oh, there's a kid with this psychological disorder, give them medication. So like, it's very ingrained in our society in the Western world, like to use medical techniques. So it's like, this model becomes really common and why we have so many syndromes and use it so much, because like it's like the very basis of our whole medical and psychological field.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole like medical model was founded in like the US side and other like Western nations. So yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about accessibility at Penn State. So this is basically just about accessibility in general with classes. So as a community at Penn State, we have made great strides in inclusivity and accessibility at Penn State. Penn State, since it is such a big public university, they are required to make sure their campus is mostly accessible to people with disabilities. So on campus, all of the classrooms have entrances, like accessible entrances. They're required to have that, which is good. And on Penn State's website, this is a statement about accessibility. So it says, Penn State is committed through our policy AD69 to ensuring that people with disabilities have an opportunity equal to that of their non-disabled peers to participate in the university's programs, benefits, and services, including those delivered through electronic and information technology. So this statement was more focused on the class aspect and the equality of like receiving equal education for people with disabilities, especially online. So policy 869 is the accessibility of electronic and information technology. So basically what this means is all of the websites that Penn State uses are accessible for people with disabilities, and it ensures that everybody has equal opportunity to attend classes, whether that's in person or online. So it makes sure that everybody is able to have all the accommodations they need and just equal opportunity when participating in classes and going to school. And student disability resources is a big part of accessibility at Penn State. So what that is the designated office that provides reasonable accommodations and services to students with disabilities enrolled at the University Park campus. So we hear about student disability resources at the beginning of each class, at the beginning of the semester. And basically, it's just a office that you can contact if you have a disability or anything that you might need accommodations for in class. So like we see in class, you can fill out a paper, send it to your professor, and they will make sure to provide the accommodations you need in class for the rest of the year, which makes sure that class is very inclusive and that everybody has an equal opportunity in class and when taking tests and all of that, which is very good for Penn State. Okay, and then the next slide is so this is more about the physical accessibility aspect at Penn State. So like we talked about before, some of the buildings at Penn State, even though almost all of them have accessible entrances, there are some that are not completely accessible to people with disabilities, such as, like we said, Beaver Stadium. People cannot, like the student section is not accessible to people that utilize wheelchairs. They have to go to the other side of the stadium and can't fit in the student section. And then downtown, there are some buildings that people cannot get into if they utilize a wheelchair. And then also on campus, which you don't always realize, some of the older buildings are not always accessible, such as older dorms, especially. Yes, they have an elevator, but sometimes that elevator is very out of the way from where they have to go. So it makes it more difficult for people with disabilities to get to their dorm. Unlike, I mean, in the renovated halls, it's more updated and more accessible because they're renovated, but we have many unrenovated dorms, so it's not as accessible. And then I'm just going to touch on the University Access Committee. So the University Access Committee approaches accessibility holistically and seeks to provide features congruent with known American with Disabilities Act priorities. So basically, you can contact the UAC if you kind of like, it's just kind of for like advocating more accessibility at Penn State. They're working on trying to make Penn State more accessible as a whole and add accommodations to people with disabilities. So, yeah, I found a lot of information on that. There's a very good article that I linked about what it's like to live a day at Penn State if you're a student with a disability, which I just found very interesting. So yeah, most of the campus is accessible, but there's still some things that we could work on to make it completely inclusive.
And I think a big thing that we have to work on with accessibility is Penn State has taken like a lot of great strides, as Nicole was talking about, in making class and testing time and buildings more accessible. But Penn State doesn't do enough, I think, when fixing the attitudinal barriers.
Yeah.
Like, we don't have enough.
Okay.
We should have like mandatory freshman seminars on inclusivity, or things in the dorms, or more just public awareness about how to treat like diverse human beings. And I think that is one of the biggest issues in what we are trying to do with things like these broadcasts, is raise awareness and education so that the attitudinal barriers can also be combated as well as the physical ones.
Yeah.
Okay, so we also have a fun game now. We wanted to make a Kahoot to kind of wrap up our discussion and bring it all together. So let's get that started. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right, here it is. Are you guys gonna join too? And hop in and play?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Say I'm
Sure.
down, because then we can talk about everything too and
Right.
just fuel our conversation with it.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. All right, I'll start it in a minute.
Give some people some time to join.
Yeah, just in case anyone wants to hop on.
Mhm.
I mean, if not, yeah, we can just use it. You can,
Yeah. Just go
if you're
over-
watching, you can just like
That's
test yourself. Yeah.
It's a review sesh. Yeah.
I don't really know what happened to my roommates.
Love it.
And they can always watch it back later and quiz themselves.
Oh, yeah.
That is very
Oh yeah.
All right, I'm gonna start it then.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, the first one. Where does the tagline "We are in this together" come from?
It's for sure High School Musical.
everybody got it. So as we talked about in the beginning, good memories. The definition of the word and its origins means symptoms running together. So we wanted to kind of transfer that from the medical model to the social model and make so that we're all in this together. Alrighty. Oh, wonderful. How did the ancient Greeks treat people with disabilities? This one is more of a trivia fact since we didn't cover it, but we wanted to see if, based on what we talked about, people could make a good guess and also it'd be an interesting fact. Yeah, so they treated them really badly. It was very much like the moral and the eugenics models where they just looked at it as something was wrong with them, so they basically left them to die. Okay, now we have a true or false question. Person with a disability is inspiring for achieving something and living life despite their disability.
I can talk about this question if you want me to.
Yeah, go for it.
The one reason this also goes to what about the stereotypes is about, that they're inspiring and they're amazing, but they're just people. They're living their life. They aren't doing something miraculous.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not because they're doing something in spite of their disability. It's impressive because they're just doing something impressive, you know? Because it kind of diminishes it if you're like, like this person with a disability is doing it. Oh, that's amazing because they have disability. It's like it kind of diminishes their achievements and such.
Exactly. Yeah. All right, awesome. Ooh, answer streak. A multi-select. So there are multiple right answers in this one.
I think I got this one wrong last time.
Oh, I forgot. I just picked one.
I got that right last time.
We did pretty good. So the definition of disability, there's two right answers because it's not very easily defined. As we talked about, there are a lot of attitudinal and physical barriers for people with disabilities. So it can be an attribute that hinders someone's ability to do certain things because society isn't accessible. But it's also a very broad concept that can be defined differently and looks different in everyone. So that's why both of those.
I also really like the term diversibility, which is kind of a disability, which is just people's different ways of living their lives and doing things. So if you hear that, that's kind of like, that's what it means. So
yeah.
All right. True or false? Penn State University is completely accessible for people with disabilities. False. Correct. We just showed that it is not.
Yeah.
It's getting competitive.
Yeah, I'm never. This stresses me.
Which model of disability is the term syndrome commonly used with? Yeah, the medical model, because it's often used synonymous with disease, which is just completely not true, and also implies that there should be a medical cure.
Yeah.
What does the tagline "We are in this together" suggest? Does anyone want to talk about this one?
Yeah, so basically, we are in this together once again. Society as a whole needs to ensure accessibility for all. So we shouldn't just be focusing on the majority of people who do not have disabilities. We need to focus on everybody, no matter what kind of disability they have, or it kind of even goes along with like race and gender. Like we need to be very inclusive just of anybody who is different from us, you know? And people with disabilities are not all the same. That was the answer that someone chose.
Awesome.
Oh, it looks like one of my roommates joined. Awesome. So it's not just us.
Despite being used so often, stereotypes are harmful. True or false? True. Absolutely. Why are the names of many well-known syndromes changing? Okay, so yeah, it's to create less harmful labels because a lot of the times they were named based off of like their scientific origins. But we found that that can be very detrimental to a lot of communities and a lot of people with disabilities, as it kind of takes away from their diversity and their what makes them different. So there's been a shift, which is very good. True or false? People with disabilities should be referred to in the way they specify they prefer. True.
Yeah, this one's important because I think like the default should always be people with disabilities, but then some people might identify as an autistic person. So I mean, like, just ask them, but I think you should always just like default to person with a disability.
Yeah, we use person first language unless someone tells you not to. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Oh, I'm another multi-select. What can we do to change the stereotypes? I think this one is 3. Yeah. So basically everything we talked about, except we should never like tell people with disabilities how they should change or how they should live their life, because we're listening to them and we're advocating for them.
Yeah.
So that's our goal. Okay, we have 2 more questions. True or false? It would be impossible to change things at Penn State to be more accessible. Woo!
Oh, everyone got it right.
We all got it.
Woo!
All right, and then, according to the social model, what are the 2 societal barriers that people with disabilities face? So, Jacqueline, do you want to explain this one?
Yeah, definitely. So going back to how I was explaining the social model, attitudinal barriers are the barriers that people have against other people with disabilities. So if you're saying something that's ableist, if you have stereotypes against people with disabilities, that's an attitudinal barrier. And then physical barriers are back to what we said, how Penn State isn't completely accessible for people with disabilities because of like not having elevators or ramps or buildings not being able to be accessible, like Beaver Stadium.
Absolutely. All right. Let's see.
All right, I placed, I think.
Woo!
Yeah.
All the fun.
Who's number 1?
Nicole claimed her first place.
Woo!
I get way too into Kahoot. Oh man.
All right, so
All right.
I'm gonna stop.
That was really good.
Yeah, that was great. We hope that with everyone watching or people who are going to be watching this later, that even if you didn't get to play, you could hear our discussion and then the questions and see the Kahoot and kind of learn from that and know the next steps you should take to be a good advocate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you everyone for coming listening.